Inspired by 1968's pro-British industry campaign I'm Backing Britain, this McCartney rocker was originally called I'm Backing the UK, before turning surrealistically into I'm Backing the USSR, and thus via Chuck Berry's 1959 hit Back in the USA, arriving at its final title. Recorded during the advance of Soviet tanks into Czechoslovakia, this fairly insensitive joke provoked the John Birch Society in America to accuse the Beatles of encouraging communism. "What we're trying to do is rock and roll," John said in '68. "With less of your philosophy is what we're saying to ourselves. And to get on with rocking because rockers is what we really are. Everybody says we must do this and that, but our thing is just rocking. That's what this new record is about. Definitely rocking. It's a return to a more rock and roll sound," Paul said. "We felt it was time to step back because that's what we wanted to do." With all of their groundbreaking releases in '67, the one thing they temporarily put off to the side during that year was straight rock and roll. And these two quotations from the Beatles explain what they wanted to achieve with the White Album this time around. In '67, the Beatles evolved among the foremost proponents of studio experimentation and, whether they realized it or not, led the Summer of Love movement. But at the same time, as a growing trend of hard rock was developing, led by Cream, the Rolling Stones, and the Jimi Hendrix Experience, the Beatles chose to focus on the simpler style. It's no accident then that the album's opener was Back in the USSR. "This just sort of came," Paul said in '68. Chuck Berry once did a song called Back in the USA, which is very American, very Chuck Berry, you know? So this one, Back in the USSR, was about, in my mind, a spy who has been in America for a long time, but he gets back to the USSR and he's sort of saying, "Leave it till tomorrow, honey, disconnect the phone," and all that. So I thought, great, I'll do a spoof on that. Beach Boys' Mike Love was another guest at the camp in India at the time, and he recalls how the song was written.
Because I was there, I think Paul came down to the breakfast table one morning saying, "Hey, Mike, listen to this." And he starts strumming and singing Back in the USSR, the verses. And I said, "Well, Paul, what you ought to do is talk about the girls around Russia, the Ukraine girls and the Georgia on my mind and that kind of thing," which he did. So I think it was the fact I was there which caused Paul to think in terms of Beach Boys. And then my suggestion from what to do in the bridge, he took that suggestion and crafted like only Sir Paul can.
And, obviously, Paul McCartney doesn't need much help writing a song, but that was a suggestion which he incorporated. He started thinking in a Beach Boys vernacular musically, and the result was Back in the USSR.
We'll sometimes do it in concert, especially if we have a private for a corporation that they want to hear other than just, or we want to play other than just the Beach Boys set, which is wonderful, but it's kind of fun to step out and do a Beatles song or a Rolling Stones song or a Motown song or whatever it might be.
What a cool story. The Beatles and the Beach Boys were great fans of each other, and it's great to see the Beatles parody the Beach Boys. It's a shame when a Beatle collaborated with a Beach Boy, it was not Brian Wilson though. Paul and Brian did collaborate on Vegetables in 1967, but that's a story for another day. Paul continues. Then we've got the humorous reference to Georgia on My Mind as sung by Ray Charles, by referring to Georgia in the Soviet Union rather than the US state. That this character somehow prefers the USSR to the USA is what makes this song funny. And once we start running through the USSR territories, we could go on for hours. It's almost as if the song is writing itself at this stage. It's a jokey song, but it's also become a bit of an anthem now. The boys officially started recording the song on August 22nd on EMI Studio 2. Although the start time for the session was set for 7 p.m., it was likely that they came much later than that, as was typical during these sessions. But Ringo was always on time. Engineer Ron Richards reveals, Ringo was always sitting in the reception area waiting, just sitting there or reading a newspaper. He used to sit there for hours waiting for the others to turn up. Engineer Peter Vince relates, "Things were getting very strained on Beatles sessions by this time. The engineers would be asked to leave. They'd say, go off for a meal or go off for a drink, and you'd know they were having heavy discussions and didn't want anyone around. On this particular day, they were playing back in USSR, and some intense arguments broke out. Paul offers us a view of what happened with an already tense Ringo on this day.
And I'm sure I pissed Ringo off when he couldn't quite get the drums to USSR and I sort of sat in. I'm actually still very aware of that. It's a very weird thing to know you can do a thing that someone else is having trouble with. Because, one, you make it very simple, but just going down and doing it and just bluffing right through it and thinking, the hell, at least I'm helping. But obviously the paranoia comes in is, but I'm going to show him up. And I was very sensitive to that. I still am. I remember sort of hours sitting around thinking, should I say anything? And in the end, it always came to, you should have said something. So, it's very hard to take the balance that.
Apparently Ringo either wouldn't or couldn't do what Paul wanted for the drumming on this particular song, and they had a little bit of a row. Ringo once said, "Every time I went for a cup of tea, he, Paul, was on the drums."
I'd heard that on some of the later Beatle albums that actually some of the drumming was either done by you or else you gave Ringo direction for it?
Very little. I gave him the what?
You gave him a sort of direction for it?
We always gave Ringo direction on every single number.
Really?
Uh-huh. It's hardly ever a number when we just said, okay, play what you feel. Mainly it was very controlled. Whoever had written the song, if it was John, he'd say, I want this. And obviously a lot of stuff came out of what Ringo was playing anyway, but we would always control it. There would hardly ever be like a break where we all didn't look at that break and think, right, we don't want anything here.
Ringo may have actually made the decision to leave the band when Paul was behind the drum kit, figuring out what he wanted to show him. Ken Scott, this session's engineer, remembers, "I remember Ringo being uptight about something. I don't remember what, and the next thing I was told that he'd quit the band." Even though the Beatles no longer had a drummer, they still made the most of this day's studio time to record the foundational backing track for Back in USSR. According to Ken Scott, the reason for Ringo's absence was not spoken about too much, and the whole thing was treated just as a Ringo's not here today kind of thing, so we just carried on as usual. This rhythm track was tried 5 times, with take 5 being considered the best one. Featuring Paul's best vocal in his belting style since Drive My Car, Back in USSR is the last of the band's great up-tempo rockers. The 3 Beatles went back to EMI Studio 2 on August 23rd to finish the song. Mark Lewison says, "The Beatles made one of their tightest and best recorded rock songs ever as a result of Ringo's absence." According to Lewison, the song was also a composite recording in other ways, with 3 bass guitar parts played by John, Paul, and George respectively, and both Paul and George playing lead guitar. John, Paul, and George then delivered Beach Boys-style harmonies, with John singing the bass portions while Paul and George hit the high notes. A few hand claps were used in these vocal overdubs. In his book, The Lyrics, Paul acknowledges, "There's a pretty blatant parody of a Beach Boys chorus in the background." By late 1968, the Beatles had long since moved on from their touring days and hence never played the song live. But the first time a Beatle played Back in USSR live was on July 4th, 1984 in Washington, D.C., when Ringo went on stage with the Beach Boys to play the song. Even though Ringo didn't play in the original Beatles rendition, he did a great job on this day. Another performance that stands out came on May 24th, 2003, when Paul performed the song in front of 100,000 people in Red Square, Moscow, as part of his Back in the World tour. Prior to the Soviet Union's collapse on December 26, 1991, the crowd could only have imagined such a show.
Because they were the writers, and they'd say, this is the song. I would play as creatively as I could, and they would say, can you do this? But sometimes I'd have 3 people telling me how to do it, And I'd play it the only way I could, and it seemed to work, you know, because the 3 frustrated drummers I used to have in my band, or in the band, because they all wanted to play drums, and I couldn't play guitar, so it didn't matter. And I think that really helped me play in a way, because they all... And I kept screaming, there's 2 drummers, you know, they're saying, play this, like on that track, I'm saying, for Christ's sake, there's 2 drums there. They could never hear that, you know, there's some drum thing going on. And so you'd have to have 4 arms to do half of the stuff they wanted me to do. So I would do it however I could.